Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Mark Feldmeir. Mark is the author of 4 books, including his latest work, A House Divided, Engaging the Issues Through the Politics of Compassion. And we're going to talk about that book a lot more because it's really an excellent book that I highly recommend. Mark has served on the adjunct faculty at Claremont School of Theology, where he's taught homiletics and has spoken at various conferences throughout the country on topics ranging from preaching, politics, and pop culture. He currently serves as lead pastor at St. Andrew United Methodist Church in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. So Mark, it's really a pleasure to have you join us here today. Greatly appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
So as I mentioned before, Mark is coming out with this phenomenal book, and I'm going to have to find my copy of it and show it to you. But I've been reading several different books, having to do with religion and politics, and specifically about the situation, very polarized situation that we're at in our country. And Mark has done some incredibly effective things within his congregation to communicate across the divides that we see, and basically wrote about that in the book. So maybe we could start, Mark, by just telling us a little bit about that book.
Yeah, the book came out of basically a sermon series that I preached in the first quarter of 2019, and I usually map out my sermons months in advance. In fact, usually 12 months in advance. And so the sermon I had scheduled for the first quarter of 2019, and we often do that here at St. Andrew, where we use the Advent Christmas season when we have generally higher attendance to sort of push something that might be a little bit more controversial on the other side, so that visitors might want to come back and hear what we have to say about issues that might be more provocative. And so we planned this 8-part series called The House Divided, and we wanted to address 8 of the most controversial issues that were affecting Americans at the time, based on a number of different national polls that indicated that these were the issues. We also, as we went through this series, we did weekly polling in our congregation and invited people to share their thoughts on any particular issues, whether those are related to healthcare or climate change, racism, medical aid and dying, Islamic extremism. And so we had the series itself kicked off actually the very week that the issue of immigration really sort of became an inflection point in our country, and it just happened to be sort of providential that as the nation's dealing with caravans at the borders and families being separated, that was the very first sermon in the series on that particular week around immigration. So it really became sort of a catalytic moment for our congregation and led us through what turned out to be a really successful sermon series.
Well, I can see why it was, and as I said, what I personally liked so much about the book was very pragmatic, very practical, and also kind of gets down to, identifying some of these really fundamental values that people can have in common, and speak about with each other without going to the polarization. So, I hope that it's like a blueprint, for other congregations to follow, for the country to follow, for some of the discussions that we need to have to heal.
Yeah, I think the one method that we found most effective in accomplishing that was to use what we called axioms. And so you'll see in the book that each chapter, as we address certain controversial issues, we do so through 3 or 4, sometimes 5 axioms that are essentially statements that regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, we can all find general agreement. So an axiom might be, simply put, the sun rises in the east, right? We could have fun with that and say, cats always land on their feet and things like that. But how do we find common ground based on a common understanding of the world and how and how the world works, how we understand God, and how we understand Scripture and reason and our experience as Christians, both in the modern world, but also over the course of our whole tradition.
So we have an election coming up. Can you talk a little bit about how you view the state of the country these days?
Well, in the book, I talk a little bit about the fact that, especially toward the end, that all the polls suggest that the country actually is not as deeply divided as maybe some of our politicians and even our cable news channels, networks would indicate. I mean, there's an advantage to exploiting some of those differences, and a lot of those are sort of centered around the quest for power and the bottom line and profit. That's not to say that our country is not deeply divided, but all of the polls suggest on all the issues that we address in the book that there's general agreement, and there typically is a majority opinion toward solving some of these issues that we may not otherwise understand. I think where we experience a crisis in our country is not necessarily around ideology, but around social disconnection and increasing individuation, right, or individualism that sort of that prizes how we personally think or how we personally feel, rather than to understand ourselves within the greater good, or what we call in the book the common good, or our common life together. And so in the book I talk about these three core commitments to a politics of compassion. And the first is kinship, and by that really I mean radical kinship. It's a way of relating to each other that transcends the tribalism that we see in our country today, and that even Jesus in his own day saw. So it's a kinship in which not only friends sit at the table with each other, but adversaries and the friendless. And so those three groups of folk get to spend time at the table together and experience what Jesus established as radical kinship, which transcended the table fellowship of his own day. We talk in the book, the second core commitment is kenosis, the Greek word that Paul uses to describe the mind of Christ in Philippians, who did not exploit his power as one equal with God, as Philippians says, but is willing to pour oneself out. So kenosis is this pouring out of oneself in radical solidarity with others for the sake of the common good. And the third is delight. This is the third core commitment. This posture or ability to perceive the other as having the image of God, the imago Dei, which prevents us then from exploiting or villainizing or otherizing the person who may or may not agree with us. And so taken together, these are sort of the core commitments to a politics of compassion that hopefully can address what I perceive to be the core issue of division in our country, which is not ideology. It's the lack of social connection, whereby we all understand that we are connected to one society, and that we all live downstream, so that what one does upstream affects everybody, right? So that's my take on where we are in the country today.
Well, profound words and very insightful, and I think incredibly useful for having kinds of conversations that need to be had. So you talked about how this came from a sermon series that you had already given a little while ago now. What kinds of things are you talking about now in the days leading up to the election, and or would you suggest that other pastors think about conveying?
Well, I think right in front of us right now it has to be the issue of racism in general and institutionalized structural racism in particular. And we, in my preaching ministry at St. Andrew, we during the month of June spent 3 weeks talking about various aspects of institutional racism and how we're implicated in that, and how we can think about the world that God calls us into, which is different. So racism has to be front and center for us as people of faith, and specifically to deal with issues of high rates of incarceration. We know that I think African Americans represent 13% of the U.S. population, but they represent 35% of the incarcerated population in America. So there's some disproportionate injustices there that we need to address. We have to address, obviously, issues of police reform, and even in my own congregation, conversations about defunding police it can become a non-starter, because it's just it's almost a sort of a slogan that separates us into tribes again. But I think it is necessary to talk about police reform and ways that we can think about local police departments responding to human needs in ways that don't necessarily criminalize people of color for things that can be de-escalated. And I think the other issues are certainly healthcare. Here we are in a pandemic. We're dealing with a healthcare system that's truly not set up to deal with responding to issues of a pandemic. That the private healthcare industry is torn between turning a profit and caring for the physical needs of the population. And I think what we're seeing is a continued struggle to reconcile those two in ways that we haven't seen before. My wife is an educator, and we actually depend on her to work to get our health care. And I hear from a lot of teachers in my congregation who share her same concerns, which are that she goes to school to teach in a classroom because she needs the health care that may actually be the health care that saves her life in the event that she actually contracts the coronavirus. And so there's a strange irony there in terms of how we've constructed our healthcare system that we need to address. And it doesn't mean villainizing big pharma necessarily, or the healthcare industry in particular, because they're just doing what they're equipped to do, which is turn a profit, and frankly to replace some hips and knees, and to do these things that hospitals do to turn that profit, because the profit's not there to deal with people in an ICU bed on a respirator for weeks, right? So we've got to put front and center this issue of healthcare in our conversations. It's big, and of course the book leads with climate change, and how do we think about? I mean, the reality is, it's believed that this particular virus was a zoonotic event, as they call it, which is basically it's passed on from other animals, wild animals in particular, which are consumed. And we have to ask the question, right? Is it possible to feed the world? And to do so in ways that don't require people to eat wild animals in certain countries. And it's just this, I think the pandemic, what it's done is exploited a lot of the issues that we can see them, or conflated them in ways that we can see them more practically in terms of the solutions.
So what about for lay people? Obviously encouraging people to get out and vote is, a paramount importance, but what other things do you recommend that just average folks try to do leading up to the election?
I think sometimes we confuse the fact that that when we talk about politics, we're thinking about the systems and structures of governance, or what we call the bonded activities like voting, or other things that we do collectively to bring about change, like not just voting, but the protests that we see in some of our cities today. If we think about politics as really this more of a relational structure that exists between us and our neighbors, that calls forth a desire and an obligation to enter into conversations that foster a common life together, that acknowledge that transcending ideology is this basic human need to flourish together in a common life. And so I think it's important that when we think about politics, we think about every interaction that we're having with our neighbors, with our colleagues at work, with our family members, with Uncle Ted across the Thanksgiving table who might disagree with us, that our work as political creatures is to foster conversations that deal with human needs in the polis, so to speak. And so I try to tell people, I think there are some good ground rules for having those conversations. One, don't talk about candidates or politicians, because those are often just our ways of talking about which team we're on. But instead of talking about politicians or candidates for office, talk about human needs, because there you're going to find some common ground. What is the common human need that you're addressing, regardless of your ideology? So to that point, don't talk about the conceptual, but talk about the concrete. What are the issues, even in your own community, that are front and center? So that when we begin a conversation with, for example, I'm not a big fan of big government, right? That's a concept which may be true for you, but what is government? What's the human issue that government in your local community needs to solve? Don't talk about differences, but talk about commonalities. What do you share in common? What are your common hopes and dreams for your community? Don't compare your best with the worst of others, right? And I think this was probably something that in the last presidential election sort of mobilized Trump's base when the language of deplorables was used, right? And so that was sort of taken on as the worst of others became for them sort of a call to arms. I tell people outlast your discomfort by staying at the table. Stay beyond your comfort level and press through that, and maybe you'll find some common ground there. And talk less and listen a little bit more, and don't forget to eat. At the end of the day, Jesus broke bread and took a cup and shared it, and he did so with whoever's in the room, even his betrayers. So there's a way to find common ground and have these conversations, in our daily lives that don't have to be win or lose or zero sum.
Well, I like your observation that politics is basically integral to everything that we do, everything that we are. And so, trying to say that because you're Christians or you're a pastor or you're in a church or whatever, that you don't want to deal with politics, I just think doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
And politics are central to our spiritual life and to the Christian experience. I mean, I tell people every Christmas we gather for Christmas Eve worship services, and we read this passage from the Gospel of Luke that talks about in the time of King Herod and when Quirinius was governor of Judea, right? And so Luke is casting this narrative of God's divine incarnation in the mess and muck of a political world as a way of confronting the powers that be, and saying there's going to be change here. There's a new narrative. So we can't be afraid to talk about politics in church. We just have to do it fairly.
And that's not to say that you don't need the separation of church and state. I mean, that's a different topic and a different need that at least personally I think has to be kept very strong, because we saw what used to happen in Europe when church and state were the same thing. We don't want that again.
Yeah, and to that point, those members of the confessing church movement in the 1930s and early 40s, they got together and drafted this remarkable statement called the Barmen Declaration, which began with this phrase, Jesus is Lord. And it's a profoundly political statement, because in affirming the lordship of Christ, you speak against the claims to lordship that Hitler made. So there's a way to be theological and to ground our conversation theologically, that are fair and judicious in our relationships with others.
So would you say that, your political views have changed over time?
I would say, yeah, probably like most of us. We learn through experiences with others that are different from us, who may have a different worldview, a different perspective, a different ideology. As you mentioned earlier, my book is highly practical. The example being that when you look at issues of climate change, I make a case with one axiom, which is, when the risks are exceedingly high, the wise hedge their bets. And my point there is, let's play the Pascal's wager there, which is highly pragmatic.
I just quoted that, by the way. I just quoted you on that. I think it was yesterday. That exact phrase about hedging your bets. I just think that is so describes that situation well.
Yeah, and so you bet that the science is right, and if you're wrong, then maybe you incur some degree of sacrifice along the way, but it's not going to be devastating, as opposed to betting that science is wrong and then being wrong and
exactly,
and facing climate disaster and war and famine and
And I kind of almost see the coronavirus in some sense a similar kind of thing. It's not terribly likely that any of us individually will get it, as long as we're taking all the precautions that we should. But if we do, it's a pretty devastating thing, or can be at least a pretty devastating thing. So it's a high risk, kind of a chance that you're taking if you ignore.
Absolutely. And the inconvenience of wearing a mask.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
is relatively small compared to the effects of contracting the virus itself. Yeah.
What it's crazy. So, if you were to think about, the overall election, not just one particular seat, one particular office, what would be the most important outcome that you'd like to see?
I think if we can try to overcome, what I often call sort of the MMA cage fight of politics, on the national scene, that'd be a good start. And and to consider that maybe one way to heal some of the divisions in our country would be for candidates at all levels to gather around themselves that team of rivals that is committed to those hard conversations. And it's a great definition of politics that Luke Bretherton came up with. He's a political theology professor at Duke. And he wrote this wonderful book, Christ and the Common Life. And he describes politics as a dance between conflict and conciliation. A dance between conflict and conciliation as we negotiate, for the common life of our country. And I think we make a big mistake if we think politics should be conflict-free. Democracy thrives on rigorous debate, and it's what's made our country what it is today. And when we eliminate one side from the debate, we sort of get the situation that we're in now as a country. So that would be one outcome, I think. I think going back to the issue of race and institutionalized racism, I think this is a lifelong effort, but, I hear people say all the time, well, look, we had an African-American president for 8 years and that didn't solve the problem. The reality is white folk like you and I have to solve the problem, not Black leaders. They didn't create the problem, we created it. And it's our job to find the solution, to learn how to deal with institutionalized racism in ways that are more, that are liberating folk. And so I would hope that conversation continues after this election, both at the national level and the local level.
Well, Mark, it was sure great to talk with you during this time. I think it's such an important time for our country. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that, the book that you wrote really is a great roadmap for us to look to. So I really appreciate you writing that. I appreciate you taking some time to talk about it today.
I'm happy to do it. I'm happy about the book and pleased with the product. And I think there couldn't be a better time to have conversations around it. So thank you.